Welcome everyone, my name is Madeline Jarrett. I'm a PhD candidate in the Theology Department here at Boston College and the Graduate Research Assistant at the Boise Center for Religion and American Public Life. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's luncheon colloquium, President Zelensky, Religion and the War. Before the main event, I'd like to offer two brief housekeeping items. This conversation will be recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. So in light of this, please silence your cell phones. They can be quite distracting if they ring. Secondly, I'd like to draw your attention to two exciting upcoming events that we're hosting at the Boise Center. A week from today, on Tuesday, April 7th, we will host BC Professor Megan Ulishny for a luncheon colloquium titled Theology in the Wild, Finding God in Nature with Wild Churches. That will take place from 12 to 1 p.m. here at the Boise Center, again, and that's next Tuesday, a week from today. The day after that, on Wednesday, April 8th, we will host our 7th annual Wolf Lecture on Religion and American Politics. Paul Eli of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs will offer his lecture entitled To the Margins, Francis, Leo, and the Crypto-Religious 1980s. Kim Garcia from Boston College will respond. That event will take place at 245 Beacon Street, which is the new Schiller Institute, in room 214 from 6 to 7:30 p.m. So the Wolf Lecture was originally scheduled in January, and there was some bad weather, so we've rescheduled it for next week. To learn more about these and our other events, you can visit our website, bc.edu/Boisi, that's BOISI. And if you prefer to get your information in trendier ways, you can follow us on social media. If at any point you'd like to get up to get more food in the kitchen, please feel free to do so and help yourself. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou to introduce our speaker.
Great, thank you, Maddie. Thanks to everyone for being here. I'm Elizabeth Prodromou. I teach in international studies, and it's wonderful to see so many people here to welcome Dr. Dmytro Vovk. I want to start by thanking Boise for hosting this. Maddie, you, and Susie, and also Mark, who I think is still in Cleveland, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, it's wonderful to have Dmytro here. He's actually going to be speaking in my senior seminar later today. The seminar is called God Goes Global, Religion and U.S. Foreign Policy. So this is a double whammy for us. Let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Dmytro Vovk is a visiting professor and a legal scholar who specializes in rule of law, church-state relations, and comparative constitutional law. He's teaching currently at Cardozo, at the Cardozo School of Law in New York with support from Yeshiva University. And his home law school, he arrived in the U.S. Temporarily, I think, in 2022. His home university is Yaroslav the Wise National Law University in Ukraine. And he also, I believe, teaches at Ukrainian Catholic University. He has had a number of distinguished posts. He was a Ken and Fulbright Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington. He's been a visiting researcher at BYU, Brigham Young University, at their J. Reuben Clark Law School. He's also been a visiting scholar at Northwestern Bovett Institute for Global Affairs. I believe you've also been a researcher at the Center for Law and Religion in the Asia Pacific program at University of Queensland School of Law. So you have a really global footprint and also a global comparative expertise. And it's really a pleasure to welcome you here to hear about the intersection of leadership, religion, and war in the case of Ukraine, which, alas, seems to have been pushed back to the back pages of the media for those who still hold paper in their hands, but also has been marginalized in terms of other things that are happening in the world. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for bringing your expertise to us today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's even bigger pleasure to speak to non-lawyers, to normal people, if you know what I mean. And I'll be speaking about Volodymyr Zelensky, President Zelensky approach to religion-state relations in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. But before that, I have to provide some preliminary remarks to sort of put you in the context, because all this Eastern European difficulties and complexities of religion-state relations, they usually have to be explained before we go to the topic. Point number one is that all post-Soviet states, when the Soviet Union collapsed, all post-Soviet states, they started almost all of them started with the same point. They adopted quite liberal laws on religious freedom and religious organizations, and most of them after that, the process started in late 1990s, turned to a more restrictive model, limiting religious competition and favoring some church. In the Orthodox majority countries such as Russia, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia as an Armenian Apostolic Church, it was also the model was also based on some specific special relations with the Church of Majority in the form of quasi-official church, endorsement church, or something like that. And the basic model in post-Soviet space now is of religion-state relations is cooperation. And I will not go into the theory of religion-state relations, but the thing that you need to understand that cooperation usually comes as sticks and carrots. Sticks means that religion is usually welcomed in the public space with some access to public funding, with some access to public education, with some access to public property, and these are carrots. But the sticks are that usually cooperation also comes with tightening state control. Ukraine has always been an exception from this trend. Ukraine has always been praised as a religious freedom champion in the region. The law that was adopted in 1991 hasn't been changed. Ukraine is the only country where this forced liberal post-Soviet law hasn't been changed much. We don't have mandatory registration for religious communities. They can operate. This is something that you take for granted in the United States, right? I can just start my religion and do whatever I want, but in most of places of the world, as you probably know, it's not an issue. You have to be registered, you have to be recognized, otherwise the government can prosecute you for unregistered religious activities. And this is what you have in Russia, this is what you have in Belarus, this is what you have in Central Asia, but this is not the case for Ukraine. You can practice your religion without registration in whatever way you want. No sort of layers of religions depending on their traditionality, depending on their size, and so on and so forth. This is again something that you can find in many places in Europe, where depending on how big you are as a religion, how old you are as a religion, you can be provided with specific status, with some money, and so on and so forth. So again, it has been not the case for Ukraine, and there were two sort of biggest religious freedom champions in the region, which is Ukraine and Estonia. And Estonia is a member of the European Union, which is again, she's under the obligations of the European Union. For Ukraine, it was a sort of exemption from the whole trend in the region where the religion freedom has been sort of valued, that was appreciated. But and it was perfect. It was specifically prized by Western institutions and American institutions because it's a sort of perfect model for Western religions to come, because they perceived this post-Soviet space as a land of re-evangelization after this atheist Soviet period, and that's why so far we have the biggest Baptist community in Europe. In Ukraine, we have the biggest Mormon community in the post-Soviet space. We have a vibrant Jehovah's Witness community, and so on and so forth. And this is a sort of phenomenon. You can't find any other country in the region where religions of minority are so visible, are so well established, are so integrated in the public life, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, and this is point number 3, that the explanation of this phenomenon is not so much legal or constitutional, which you probably have here in the United States, right? It's not about constitutional frameworks or legal regulations. It's more about social and political context, relatively weak central power, and political and religious pluralism of the country, which is sort of counterbalance different religious and political influence. On the regional level in Ukraine, we have at least 3 religious groups that claim to be the religion of majority in the respective regions. One is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, historically and ecclesiastically affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate, that is the domineering in eastern and southern part of Ukraine. Another one is the Independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is well established in central and part of western region. And finally, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, again the biggest Catholic church of the Eastern Rite in the world, which is domineering in the region called Galicia, which is Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, and some other territories. And they all to be claimed either to be a or the national church of the country. So you can imagine that this is there's a highly competitive religious market with different religious communities compete each other. And on the personal level, on political level, you can imagine a Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky, maybe 8 years ago, a Jewish prime minister, a Greek Catholic prime minister, a Baptist who was an acting president in 2014, and so on and so forth. And this is again a sort of unique for the region, where you have Orthodox majority country and you have a quite high level of tolerance to somebody which could perceived as a sort of minority in some other places in this region. Point number 4 is that the reasonable question is why, especially for lawyers, right? Why presidents' views on religion-state relations are so extremely important to talk about that. And of course, I do understand that politicians' views on these issues matter, also in liberal democracies, because political fluctuations they are sort of counterbalanced, as I said, by constitutional protections and legal regulation. Despite all the tendencies that you have here, since January 2025, still you have the First Amendment, and still you have, even under this composition of the Supreme Court, very conservative, very open to free exercise of religion. Still, there is some limits that the court is probably not able to cross. And some recent votes shows that, for example, Amy Coney Barrett is much more supportive of the establishment clause than we initially thought her to be. Plus federalism, plus state constitution protections, and so on and so forth. So in liberal democracies, it works like that. You have this constitutional framework, and it is sort of restrict political fluctuations and political discretion. But beyond liberal democratic world, for example, in the post-Soviet space, mainly religion-state relations, they have been a matter of political relations rather than constitutional protections, because the role of constitution is much lower. It's more a declaration rather than a real working document. And it's interesting that this is something that is common for very different countries. Like, for example, you can have very different religious policies, as a matter of fact, in democratic countries such as Ukraine, or in authoritarian countries such as Russia. But what is common that those relations are more sort of based on political agreements, sort of political patronage, this exchange of religious legitimacy for some public benefits, and so on and so forth. It does not fully annihilate, fully erase the rule of law. Still, constitutional legal frameworks are often compromised by these informal practices, and the scope of protected religious exercise is more determined by political deals rather than by human rights standards, even if the government has committed to them. And you can see this in many domains of like everyday religious life. It's much easier to be registered, it's much easier to get support, to obtain a plot of land, to conduct a public event, if you have this political sponsors that will help you to do it, right? And that's why the position of religion of majority in a certain region actually matters a lot. And on the highest level of power, when it comes to key decisions about religion-state relations, it's obvious that has always been a domain of the president to decide, depending on president's personal views and political considerations about religion. In Ukraine, we have this tendency of being closer to Moscow, being closer to the independent church, being more open to religious minority, more close to religious minority, and so on and so forth. And finally, point number 5, that the quintessential issue of Ukraine's religion-state relations is the competition between the two Orthodox churches. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine in late 1980s, it was split in two parts. I will not go with it, so it's a very long and difficult story, Elizabeth known, but more or less we have two competing Orthodox churches. One is the Independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, OCU, which was recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate in 2019, and another one, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, historically and ecclesiastically affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate. It's difficult to say to what extent it's integrated to the Moscow Patriarchate, but at least ecclesiastically they maintain relations with the Moscow Patriarchate. And as I said, different presidents, they support different churches, but none of the government, and this is also important of Ukraine, because central power, even now, by the way, even during the war, the central power is relatively weak. None of the governments, none of the presidents were able to fully sort of eliminate or fully oppress the church that he, because they were all men, that he doesn't like, that he didn't like. It was also coming back and forth, more support for Moscow, more support for the independent church. Now, I forgot about slides. Since 2014, the Orthodox relations have become a matter of national security, has been securitized because of the beginning of the hybrid stage of the war. Putin justified the annexation of Crimea with spiritual arguments. He claimed specifically that Crimea for us, it's historical nonsense, but still, the Crimea for us is a sort of Temple Mount, the same as Temple Mount for Jews. Even more spiritual arguments arrived in 2022 when he used religion as a sort of casus belli. The Ukrainian government's response was to intensify its work on obtaining the ecclesiastical recognition for the independent church, because previously it existed as a sort of non-recognized Orthodox church, and it resulted because President Poroshenko, the first president on the slide, he believed that it will support Ukraine's political independence if we also have independent Orthodox church. And this resulted in 2019 in Patriarch Bartholomew's decision to provide so-called Thomas ecclesiastical independence to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The autocephaly was a child of the fifth president, the child of Petro Poroshenko. The Thomas was granted in January 2019, and the next month the presidential campaign started, where Thomas was promoted as one of Poroshenko's biggest achievements. Right, one of the sort of biggest tasks of his first term as the president. But these elections became a triumph for Volodymyr Zelensky, who was absolutely silent, even ignorant about religion. The sixth Ukrainian president entered politics as a person with no personal interest in religion beyond Instagram photos of Eastern baskets, and no religious agenda in his program beyond the celebration of Ukraine's religious diversity. Literally, in his program, he said 0 words about religion and 0 words about any sort of identitarian issues and so on and so forth. But since then, you can see a photo from almost comic photo, almost comedian photo from 2019. Was this 2020? The COVID started. And then a sort of much more heroic photo, because he started present himself as being in the sacred spaces, Ukrainian sacred spaces, and in front of icons and so on and so forth. And it seems like he has made a quite impressive religio-political journey. In December 2022, after the beginning of the invasion, he proposed a law that will ban the Ukrainian Orthodox Church for its affiliation with the Moscow Patriarchate. The law was adopted in 2024, and I will speak about the details a bit more. And Zelensky promulgated this law, saying that it will finally bring spiritual liberation. It's quite a sort of strong word, spiritual liberation of Ukrainians from, I quote, Moscow devils. Right, so it's a sort of religiously infused, injected political rhetoric, which was completely impossible in 2019. So I will discuss the Zelensky personal approach to religion and the dynamics of his religion state policies since 2019. During his presidential campaign, Zelensky, as I said, was very vague about religion and his religious policies. Partly it was a deliberate strategic choice to be silent, because his voters had very different views on that issue, but it also mirrored his personal sort of lack of interest and experience in religion. Zelensky is a Russian-speaking person of Jewish origin from a big industrial city in eastern Ukraine, Kryvyi Rih, which can easily be described as the most secular identity in Ukraine. Literally, he represents it's a portrait of the most secular person in the country. He was raised in an assimilated family where Jewishness has been a matter of family history. Some of his ancestors were murdered in Holocaust. Jewishness was a matter of self-understanding as a discriminated group, and maybe some cultural influences, such as this Eastern European Jewish cuisine, which my mother likes to cook. But it has never been a matter of religion or language. Like in Jewish studies, it's often called thin Jewish identity, in contrast to thick Jewish identities, for example, many American Jews possess. So from the perspective of American Jews, Zelensky could hardly be defined as a Jew. His parents never observed Shabbat or followed kashrut and seemed well integrated in the Soviet style of life. Being a talented showman and entertainment manager, Zelensky received very poor formal education. He obtained a law degree. He's a lawyer, by the way. If compared to Abraham Lincoln, this is sort of very relevant. Hope Lincoln was a better lawyer, which, based on his papers, he really did, which would probably prevent him from being hired by any reputable firm. It's literally garbage, trash school, the worst school in the country, where his father taught some economics or something like that. And it's a very, very poor education. So, but again, when you listen to him, you can feel that his understanding of politics, law, society, economics, or religion is more based on his own experience as a businessman, as a showman, and so on. As a very successful person, rather than or expertise of his affiliates, rather than any sort of comprehensive system of views or convictions. After becoming the president, Zelensky spoke very little about his personal attitude toward faith and never demonstrated it in public. His Christmas and Easter presidential addresses of first years before the beginning of the invasion were usually very short and written from the perspective of a religiously neutral observer. To those who celebrate, I congratulate those who celebrate, right? On different occasions, the sixth Ukrainian president demonstrated that his secular stance was really really genuine and neutral. For example, I remember in 2019, before the parliamentary election, he was inspecting some state companies in the Odessa region, and one of his affiliates asked a company manager about his previous work with some organizations affiliated with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And it was clear because Zelensky turned around to him, looked at him and said, what's the matter? What's the sense to discuss the religion of this person? It was so sort of natural reaction that religion is just irrelevant to management and so on, that it was quite visible. When Russia's full-scale invasion began, Zelensky's religious messages have changed. His Easter addresses have become longer, theologically loaded, and articulated as messages not to those who celebrate, but to all of us who celebrate. And since 2023, he started celebrated those religious fests based on the new calendar, right? So, because Ukraine departed from the Orthodox old calendar, and Zelensky synchronized with this new calendar, it has become sort of an official position. Even though Zelensky has become publicly closer to religion, he doesn't speak about religion beyond any special occasions like religious fests or meetings with religious leaders, and his improvised or semi-improvised religious interventions are still very lapidary and vague. At one of the meetings with religious leaders, he characterized the goal of religion as the protection, I quote, all that is good and human in human nature, which is almost a tautology, and spoke about religion communities in a very instrumental way as kind of spiritual providers of spiritual, vendors of spiritual services and humanitarian aid to Ukrainians and supporters of Ukraine abroad. In one of his recent interviews, he was asked about his own faith, how his own faith had changed since the war had begun, and he responded that, I quote, we all, pause, become more faithful because we are, pause, like all people in the situation of the war, people fight and pray. And this Zelensky, we, not I, right? And his carefulness and difficulties in finding proper words about religion demonstrate that he still speaks about religion as something very abstract and less interesting and important for him personally, but as he believes something much more concrete and important for his voters, for Ukrainians, for the Ukrainian people. And thus one may conclude that Zelensky's practical interest in religion and relations with religious communities have been growing, but this growth is not based or accompanied with any significant personal religious or spiritual changes. American journalist of, I think of the Russian Jewish origin, Simon Schuster, he wrote a book, Showman, and he quotes Zelensky saying in the book, that Zelensky said, the main purpose in life is to be needed by others, the end of quote. The war and Russia's war crimes that made the president think that it's again a quote, "The devil is not far away." Zelensky words, "Devil is not far away." So probably the war has sort of strengthened and spiritually colored this goal for the Ukrainian president to win the war, but it has not changed or enriched his personal attitude or practice of religion, at least in traditional sense of religion. Now let's turn to religion as a matter of Zelensky policy. The war with Russia has strengthened the politicization of Ukraine, of religion in Ukraine, as I said. Putin's reference to the spiritual roots or spiritual causes of the war has transferred to inter-Orthodox relations and conflict in a matter of security, and that and the security discourse of over the Ukrainian Church, Orthodox Church affiliated with Moscow, which was completely marginal, or at least very controversial before the war, has become the central issue of Ukraine's state religious policies and contributed, if not resulted, in the creation of the independent Orthodox Church and its recognition by Patriarch Bartholomew. In his presidential campaign, Zelensky played against this politicization. He actually played against the argument that religion is a matter of security, while the fifth president, Petro Poroshenko, was competing under the slogan "Army, Language, Faith," which means stronger army, more protection for the Ukrainian language, and more protection for the Ukrainian religion. Zelensky ignored religion as something irrelevant, or at least less important for elections, and focused on anti-corruption, economic development, social welfare, and so on and so forth. And this strategy worked very well. He triumphed both on presidential but also on the parliamentary elections. During the first years of his presidency, Zelensky often ignored important religious celebrations. It's literally like that. He posted on Twitter, "Oh, today is an important celebration. Congratulations to all." While previous Ukrainian presidents, they will probably join a manifestation, a rally, and be with the flock, and so on and so forth. And in his public messages, Zelensky never referred to God or religion beyond the celebration of Ukraine's religious pluralism and encouraging Ukraine to learn to live together despite their political, cultural, linguistic differences, and notwithstanding whatever church they go to and whenever they celebrate Christmas. So it's more about it's great that we are so diverse rather than that religion is important to us. Well, the president conducted several meetings with key religious figures, and you saw one of the slides, including both leaders of the Orthodox Church. Right after he had won the presidency, he did not prioritize or favor any of the churches and was not interested in maintaining any regular dialogue with religious groups. Even after the full-scale invasion, first maybe 6-7 months after the invasion began, and because right after the invasion, oppositional politicians and public activists, they started right away demanding to ban the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine because it's a sort of spiritual fifth column, and we don't want to tolerate it. And not just because it's a matter of our kind of military protection, military defense, but also because it's completely intolerable. We don't want anything Russian in our public space. We don't want Russian language. We don't want Russian culture. We don't want Tchaikovsky. We don't want Pushkin. We also don't want the Russian Orthodox Church. And Zelensky was quite silent on that, and he was not of any support to this sort of rhetoric. But that position has changed significantly in the fall of 2022, when the Ukrainian security service, so-called SBU, started searching the premises of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and initiating dozens of criminal persecutions against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Church bishops and clerics. And again, it might be interesting to familiarize ourselves with the result of those prosecutions. So you have the church of probably more or less 8,000 communities and 10,000 clerics. And so far the SBU has reported about 200 criminal proceedings, resulted in approximately 50 court verdicts, and some of them maybe about a dozen of those court verdicts, they deal with national security crimes. It's, for example, treason, collaboration of the Russian military, sharing data about the Ukrainian military with the Russian military, this sort of stuff. But the rest is more or less two types of crimes. It's the spread of religious hatred Again, in contrast to American constitutional law, hate speech is prohibited in Ukraine. And it's also the glorification of the war, the justification of the war. And the basic scenario of all those criminal cases is that a rural priest would talk either in person or online in a chat with a bunch of old ladies, so-called babushkas, some nonsense about Putin as a savior of the world. Sometimes it's also combined with anti-Semitic speech, which is again very popular in this sort of community. But more or less, it's something like that. You have 5 babushkas and a rural priest talking to them, and this is the basic scenario. And then we have to decide to what extent it's a significant challenge to the Ukrainian national security, but probably for the SBU it is so. And as a response to these findings, that there are these cases coming more and more about USC clerics, Zelensky initiated the law to ban the Russian Orthodox Church. And the law was adopted in 2024. The law imposes automatic ban on the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. You don't have to do anything as the government; it's just automatically banned. And the law also established a court procedure, so you still have to go to court to ban Ukrainian religious communities affiliated with the Russian Church. You have to go to court and to prove. But the basic concept, the affiliation, what does it mean to be affiliated with Moscow? Defined very broadly. It can be organizational affiliation, it can be administrative subordination, but it can also be ecclesiastical connections. More or less, it's enough to recognize Moscow Patriarch Kirill as my spiritual leader, to be recognized as affiliate. More or less, it's enough to say we are a part of the Russian Orthodox Church to be considered for the liquidation. And the affiliation is a sort of it's a crime per se. You don't have to prove that you were actually directed by the Russian church or by the Russian military or by the Russian intelligence service. You don't have to prove to you that you are involved in any sort of illegal behavior, unless you are able to fully sever your ties with the Russian church publicly and loudly, as the government requires you to do. You can be liquidated. In addition, in the 2024 law imposes a ban on religious organizations involved in the dissemination of the so-called Russian world ideology, Ruski Mir ideology, a vaguely defined narrative of Russia's exclusive political and spiritual rights to control Ukraine. This is a sort of ideological justification of the Russian aggression, right? Russia has some specific exclusive rights over the neighboring states, especially over Ukraine and Belarus, because it's a sort of core part of the Russian civilization. And this is a combination of both ideological arguments, but also theological arguments. And the Ukrainian parliament tried to translate it into legal regulation, and religious organizations involved in the dissemination of this sort of ideology in Ukraine can be banned. And the law defines, it's worth reading, sorry for the long quote, but I think it's worth. The law defines the Russian world ideology as a Russian neo-colonial doctrine grounded in chauvinist, Nazi, racist, xenophobic religious ideas, images, and goals of the destruction of Ukraine, the genocide of the Ukrainian people, and non-recognition of the sovereignty of Ukraine and other countries, aiming at the violent expansion of the Russian supranational imperial space as a tool of the special civilizational right of Russians to mass murder, engage in state terrorism and military interventions in other countries, occupy territories, and expand the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church beyond the territory of the Russian Federation. If you do something like that, you can be banned. And lawyers know that it's probably the worst thing to regulate ideologies, because you never know how to shape what you are regulating. It's very, and that's why ideological bans, they're quite rare, right? Because when you ban, for example, the denial of Holocaust or the denial of the Armenian genocide, you at least can say, what are you banning? But when you have this neo-colonial, whatever, chauvinistic stuff to do mass murders, it's very difficult to preserve some sort of narrow application of this law, because it's very, very easy to expand to many issues. And the most difficult issue here is that this prohibition deals with the real problem. right? The Russian government and the Russian Orthodox Church has weaponized religious arguments, spiritual arguments to attack Ukraine. And this is also true that Russia's Ukraine have shared spiritual tradition. However, a very broad and vague definition like that can potentially make the application of this prohibition fully discretionary. Because, for example, if me as an Orthodox community celebrate the same saints as the Russian Church, is the involvement in the spread of the Russian world ideology? If me celebrates, for example, recognizes that the last Tsar Nicholas II is the saint because the Russian Church canonized him, if for me it's also saint, do I spread the Russian world ideology, and so on and so forth? And obviously, as you can see, this sort of regulation, they have expanded the role of religion, the role of the state in regulating religion, because the state, probably first in the Ukrainian history, has interfered into theology, right? The state has acquired a power to speak about theology, to speak about symbols, to speak about identities, and to decide whether this identity should be allowed or should be prohibited. Zelensky framed these measures as a sort of the protection of what he called spiritual independence of Ukrainians, implying that Ukrainians' spirituality should be included into the security domain and be protected as such by the state. So security is not just about political independence or military defense, it's also about culture, it's also about language, it's also about religion, and this is something that the government should take care of. And this approach obviously contrasted with Zelensky pre-invasion views. The question of what church to attend is not relevant anymore. Whatever church doesn't work if one attends the Moscow church, because that church should be prohibited. It is still irrelevant, however, if one belongs to any other religion. You see, so it's not like drifting to some preference, some specific religious preferences. You can do whatever you want unless you belong to the Moscow church. So it's a sort of religious freedom -1. Unless you belong to the forbidden church, you can do whatever you want. And this is again the contrast between Zelensky and all previous Ukrainian presidents. Zelensky shift towards the securitization of religion and rather interference approach to inter-Orthodox relations is based on combination of three basic factors. First, in contrast to the president himself, the security part of his team has been both significantly more attentive to the religious aspect of the war with Russia and much less neutral in with respect to relations between the two Orthodox churches. More or less, his security people, including the current head of the president office, Kirill Budanov, they're quite supportive in the independent Orthodox Church because they consider the Moscow Church as a sort of Moscow arm. The second factor is a public opinion in Ukraine. Zelensky is more or less classic populist politician, right? He is very concerned of what people think, and I'm sure that at least at the beginning of his presidency, he believed that his main goal is to give people what they want, to sort of mirror the people. And in Ukraine now there is a sort of public consensus. The sociology is a bit tricky and we can go into that, but more or less there is a public consensus. There are no voices in the public space, maybe somewhere in private spaces, but not in the public space. There are no voices against that, and there is a consensus that the Moscow church must be banned, must be prohibited. In addition to remnants of Russian culture, in addition to toponyms that should be renamed, in addition to school curricula that should be changed, no Russian literature, no Dostoevsky, no this second-class old writers, as people sometimes tend to call them, or Tolstoy and whatever. And it's the same with religion. Since April 2022, public opinion poll shows very high level of support that the church must be banned, or at least put under very, very, very strong restrictions. And finally, a rapid shift from the whatever church principle to spiritual independence has been eased by Zelensky's personal secularity or even religiosity. The Ukrainian president continues treating religion as a purely political issue and perceiving measures against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church affiliated with Moscow as measures aimed to cut Russia's influence on Ukraine through the church leadership involved in these shady political games and infiltrated by the FSB and before that by KGB, by the way. right? Lacking personal religious communitarian experiences and literacy, Zelensky ignores or at least underestimates non-political aspects of separating one Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, from the Russian Church, such as, for example, the role of mutual recognition within the global Orthodoxy or the nature of the split within the Ukrainian Orthodoxy, which could hardly be reduced to the dichotomy, the Moscow Church versus national Church, which is much more difficult issue. And finally, Zelensky's shift to a more securitized and politicized approach to religion has been provoked changes in Ukraine's model of religion-state relations. That's why I started with the model. In October 2024, while presenting his plan of Ukraine's resilience, the Ukrainian president announced that the state would develop cooperational relationship with all religions, but not with the Moscow Church, which time is over. In May 2025, the government started the process of the liquidation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. They brought a case to a court. It's still in the trial court, and they're trying to ban the ruling body, the Kiev metropolis of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And as long as the court recognizes that it's affiliated with Russia, it automatically means that the rest of the structure is also affiliated with Russia, and the government can shut them down. But in addition, the government is also drafting a new religious law to shift Ukraine's model of religion-state relations to a more cooperative model. Again, the sort of one of two religiously neutral countries in the post-Soviet space, Ukraine and Estonia. And with Estonia, by the way, it's the same, because Estonia is also drafting some restrictions in religion and strengthen the presence of the Estonian government in religion, but it's a different story. And the draft law that I saw, it still hasn't been published yet, but I saw the sort of preliminary draft. It's a classic, as I said, sticks and carrots document. It provides access for some religions to public funding, public property, public education, and this is what Ukrainian Protestants are dreaming about, right? To sort of erase all this gender nonsense from state curricula and so on and so forth. But it also tightens the government's control over religion in terms of registration, limiting non-registered activities, limiting state competition and access to religious market. For example, based on that law, we expect that there will be one Greek Catholic Church, one Orthodox Church, one Armenian Church, and so on and so forth. This is again not something that was not the case previously. And this is the most paradoxical part of the story, it's the final point. Because of the war and because of political and social transformations, the most secular and personally religiously neutral Ukrainian president is leading the country to a significantly more restrictive and also less secular model of religion-state relations. The outcome that Volodymyr Zelensky of 2019 would have never imagined.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. If you wouldn't mind raising your hands, we can go around. And just a reminder, please make sure that your question ends in a question. And keep it brief, because we only have 15 minutes.
Okay, do you want to?
Who will moderate?
Go for it.
Okay. First question here.
Sure. I think everyone here will thank you for a very comprehensive view, and one that also portends grave considerations for the future. I think also everyone around the table would say that while you are operating from a classic Western liberal perspective on freedom of religion, in point of fact, it's less the American experience than it is the Eastern European experience that will determine this history. So my question for you is this. In America, we've only ever twice had major religious coloration to a war. As Abraham Lincoln famously said, both sides, North and South, prayed to the same God, read the same Bible, and came to diametrically opposed results. The other time religion really colored a war was the Revolutionary War. The Congregationalists, the Baptists, the Methodists, and certainly the Irish Catholics supported the Revolutionary Patriots, whereas the Anglican Church very much supported the King. And of course, 1783, a lot of those Anglican clerics decided it was time to go to Canada. Well,
or back to England.
Yes. It was not the American experience then I want to ask you about. It's the Eastern Orthodox experience. We know that ever since the foundation of Constantinople, the alliance of church and state, of throne and altar, has been far more powerful in the East than the intermittent alliances in the West. Eastern Orthodoxy has always had a state that tips the church as to where it should stand. how possibly could Ukraine overcome 1,000 years of that history?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think there are at least two basic answers. The first answer is because of the competition, because the church split 30 years ago, and it has produced a tremendous effect on how people treat religion-state relations. Because if you compare, for example, with any other Orthodox country where the Orthodox Church is united and is the church of 70, 80, 90% of people, you will see that in Ukraine people are significantly more tolerant to religious minorities. Not in the sense that they really like it. They still call Baptists sectants or cultists and whatever, and they have no idea what the difference between Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons. But they are tolerant in the sense that they recognize that they could be around. We don't care. Right, you could do your strange stuff here, I don't care. It's not the best form of tolerance, but still. Right, and plus, Ukraine has also the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is very important, and which maintain relations with Vatican, and Vatican backed the church, and which is very successful because they made a journey from the Forbidden Church during the Soviet time to kind of now they have their representation in Kiev, and they claim to be a national church of Ukraine. Now there's a formula, Christianity of Kievan tradition, which means Orthodox but also Greek Catholics. And they established the most successful Ukrainian private university, and very prestigious now, and so on and so forth. And the second point that, in my view, I'm lawyer, right? So it's difficult for me to make all the sociological interventions, or religious. But I think it's also the Soviet experience. Ukraine is a secular country. Mm-hmm. One of the results of the Soviet experience that Ukraine has been secularized significantly. Mm-hmm. Not in the sense that religion doesn't matter. Religion matters, and 90% of Ukrainians would say, "Oh yeah, religion matters," but it's not so much about religion in this traditional sense as humanitarian life and involved in certain communication with co-believers and so on. It's more what Catherine Warner from Penn State, she's leading scholar in Ukraine and post-Soviet religiosity, she calls it faith rather than religion. People have faith in, sometimes it's about traditional religion, sometimes it's souls of the people, sometimes it's their grandfathers died during the Second World War and this sort of stuff. So religion matters, but in a very different way. And again, if you compare with the United States even now, I would say, at least my personal experience, that the United States is way more religious than Ukraine. Way more religious. I do understand that there is a difference between Orthodox religiosity and a Catholic or Protestant religiosity, but still it matters. When you have 30-40% of people going to church every week or every month, and you compare with Ukraine where it's about 9% of people who go to church every week or every month. And if you, and minus Protestants, it will be 7%, and minus Greek Catholics, it will be 4%. So it's literally in the church of majority, it's a tiny minority of people who really live religious life. It's more about belonging. I'm Orthodox, I can be Jewish and Orthodox in Ukraine. There is no problem with that. Can you imagine an American Jew who would say, I'm Jewish, but I'm also Orthodox, I can go to church? It's probably impossible. But in Ukraine, it's completely fine. I mean, my mother, she's Jewish, but she can go to Orthodox church. She has no problem with that, and still would pursue herself as a Jew. So it's more secular society.
Thank you very much.
I think you had your hand up next.
Sure, just from a personal point of view, in terms of Zelensky himself, it certainly sounds like he's become from an agnostic to a person of faith. Would you say that that's a correct assessment?
I think he has not become a person of faith. He is more sort of now, I think, treats himself as a sort of person of mission. There is a sort of spiritual overtones in what he's doing for the country. This is for sure. He believes that this is his mission, this is his destiny, and that's why I don't want, I don't want lift, but I need ammunition. If you remember this, at the beginning of the war, because it's my destiny. It's what the people wants me to do. But it's not religiosity in the traditional sense. He doesn't go to church. This is for sure. He doesn't speak about religion much beyond the specific occasions. And he doesn't live any sort of meaningful religious life because, again, his identity is probably very, very secular.
Here was a question, and then my chair. over
Did
there.
the banning of the Moscow church result in significant confiscation of church assets, properties, wealth, and so forth? And if so, did the government dedicate those properties, maybe hospitals and schools, other forms of social benefits, to providing support for the social network?
Yeah, this is again one of important differences between religiosity in the Orthodox world and in here in the West or in the United States, because Orthodox religion is almost never about schools and hospitals. This is an interesting issue because the Orthodox Church traditionally has no business in providing health care or providing. This is something what Protestants actually brought to Ukraine in 1990s, where you want to go to church, but you can also share food with us, or we can provide you with some services, and so, and let me tell you about the God, and so on. But the Orthodox Church can, especially this tradition, and it's everywhere. It's even more in the Russian Orthodox Church. It's even more in the Georgian Church. That our main mission is to sort of preserve the national spirituality. Our main mission is to pray. It's up to the government. It's government's business to provide health care, education, and so on and so forth. And if you think about the Russian Empire history, for example, orphanages that started in Middle Age Europe as church institutions, they started as state institutions. It was the government who established first orphanages in the Russian Empire. But where you are right is that it's also about churches. It's about all these historical buildings that the government provided in lease or in rent to the Moscow Patriarchate in particular. The government
Monasteries, convents.
Yeah. And it's actually quite a number. I think now the Ukrainian Orthodox Church affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate, they have about 3,000 churches in lease, which and the law prescribes once they are banned, if they are banned, that all should be taken away from them. And the government will probably transfer it to the competitor, to the rival church, the independent church of the Moscow Patriarchate. But it's a part of symbolical war, because it's also about this very significant, historically important monasteries in Ukraine. But it's also about regular church property. And yes, if the government imposes the ban, those property will be taken from them and probably transferred to another church, to the other church.
Thanks. Super informative about the alignment of the nation and this church against Moscow. It's been really interesting. I'm wondering, maybe counterintuitively, given how secular the society is you're describing, but have there been bridge building or peacemaking efforts, either on the ground or at higher levels, to connect Orthodox members, leaders, to try to limit the conflict?
You mean between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, or between Russian speakers and Russian Orthodox parishioners in eastern Ukraine. You know, has the former connectedness between the traditions offered any space for violence reduction or conflict reduction amidst the chaos and murder of it all?
Yeah, this is a very logical question, right? Because this is what we expect religious actors to do. There are two dimensions. First, between Russia and Ukraine is just no way. The Russian Orthodox Church has sided with Putin, has endorsed the war. Patriarch Kirill said that Russian soldiers died in Ukraine will have their sins withered away. You know, this is so theologically problematic and so on. And there were many other similar statements, and the Russian Orthodox Church declared that 1/6 of their priests went to the battlefield and spent some time in the battlefield. The church has involved in providing support, ammunition. The church is involved in diplomatic efforts of the Russian government, has spread Russian propaganda. And there was one of the recent investigations that the church even involved in recruiting new soldiers in Africa. Can you imagine that? People come in Africa, they come to the church, and then the priest would say, would you like to go to sign a contract with the Russian military and go to Ukraine, and so on. There were at least one person who was killed after this, who was murdered in Ukraine after this recruitment. In Ukraine, it's again very difficult because there is no dialogue between the independent church and the Moscow Patriarchate. There are some bishops in both churches that probably are more constructive and probably would like to somehow set up some sort of dialogue and resolve this issue in some peaceful way. But the problem is that, not the problem, but the sort of good news is that it's not a big deal so far for Eastern Ukrainians and Western Ukrainians. It's not. It's important to understand that it's not a religious conflict. It's not conflict about religion. It's a conflict about religious and Ukraine's independence. Even for Putin, with all this rhetoric about Mount Temple and whatever, everybody knows it's about Ukraine's independence, which means that religion is a sort of kind of irrelevant to that in both positive and negative way.
Thank you.
Yes, over in the corner.
Do you have a sense of how receptive the Ukrainian public has been to Zelensky's efforts to incorporate religion more, or has there been backlash to policies such as banning the Moscow church?
No, there is a sort of strong support, and I think that was I was trying to say, that it's actually something that encourages Zelensky to go ahead with this policy, because there is a strong public support of interference into religion in the life in that specific church, because it's not so much about religious life but more about security concerns. And Zelensky, as I said again, is a populist politician. He can't ignore it, and I think they even play on that issue, because when there are some sort of negative attitude in the society growing, they can play this religious card and sort of deviate the attention of the people to that issue. So it's more a part of political agenda. And definitely now in Ukrainian society, it's a sort of consensus from everybody, starting from politicians and ended up with comedians. We have like comedians making jokes about priests, and then so it's a sort of the dirtiest joke you can ever make about, oral sex with minors. And then at the end, but we all understand that it's not about priests, it's about the Moscow Patriarchate. Mm-hmm. So this is not to say it's a good or bad joke. I mean, again, people are free to speak whatever they want. It's probably a bad joke for me, but maybe somebody likes. But this is just to say that this is a sort of what you can get from the air. People think that this is good for Ukraine.
How do you see the war playing out? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Okay, here and then back there. Yeah.
We have time for, maybe if both of you would mind
Yeah.
saying your questions briefly, and then you can respond. We have 2 more minutes.
That was it. How do you see the war playing out?
I don't know. I do believe that the war will not be over this year. It's quite clear. I do think that Putin has not so many reasons to stop, especially after the January 2025. I do think that they will have as much soldiers as they want so far, because they pay so much money to Russian people. There was a good research showing that if you are 40 in Russia, and you don't live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, and if you sign the contract with the military, if you're being paid, and then you will die, and your family will get some sort of compensation, you will earn more than in any sort of business in Russia for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. Which stimulates dozens and dozens, thousands of people to join the contract. You can't imagine. And this is also, by the way, to the fact that this war is not about values; it's about money. These are not soldiers dying for some sort of ideology, idea. Putin, Kirill, whatever, they're dying for money. This is important to understand. So yeah, unfortunately, if somebody would have told me 5 years ago that we are entering such a period, I would never understand, because it was always a matter of kind of national pride in Ukraine, that yes, we have problems with corruption, we have problems with rule of law, we have problems with institutions, but we did manage to separate from the Soviet Union collapsed, at least in our part of the region, peacefully. But then it happened that it was not the end of the story.
Peter, I think you have a question.
I was just interested if you could say a little more about the relations between the Greek Catholic Church and the 2 Orthodox churches, how they've changed during the war.
Can I add a footnote question?
Mm-hmm.
You described a situation that runs completely counter to the hegemonic narrative in the American media, and certainly in terms of the political elites we hear from, where we're seeing a religious freedom and a religious ecosystem metamorphosis that is incompatible with international law and bad for the future democracy of Ukraine. What do you think accounts for the unwillingness of political and intellectual elites to acknowledge that reality?
First of all, to both of your questions, there is one premise that whatever I'm saying critical about Ukraine, it doesn't undermine the fact that first it's a Russian aggressive war, and the Russian Orthodox Church has did a lot of worse, much worse things in these terms, right? So the biggest religious freedom problem in the region is Russia, both in the country but also on the occupied territories. The second issue, first of all, there are no relations between Greek Catholics and the Moscow Patriarchate, at least on the top level. So far,
within Ukraine.
Within Ukraine, I mean the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, at least on the highest level, there are no meetings. Maybe there are some informal contacts just to sort of be in touch and so on. More or less, the rest of religious landscape of Ukraine is supportive to what President has been doing, because they believe that it's true, but probably they also think that the government will benefit them in some way because of that support. The relations between the independent church and Greek Catholic is much more interesting, because there was a strong impulse to create some sort of, to start some sort of even unification process after the beginning of the invasion, because we are sort of two churches, so independent church of the Kiev tradition and so on and so forth. But now relations, at least between leaders, Sviatoslav Shevchuk, the leader of Ukrainian Greek Catholics, and Epifani, who is the Metropolitan Epifani, the leader of the independent church, they're quite cold, because Epifani seems to be very jealous because Shevchuk is popular, the Greek Catholic leader is popular, is much more publicly visible, he's much more charismatic, by the way, because Epifani is he lack of this linguistic skills to speak publicly and so on and so forth. So as I understand, it's a sort of, they still a kind of cooperate because they have this common enemy, which is the Moscow Patriarchate. But it's very interesting to see if the Moscow Patriarchate is banned, how the relations would develop, because Epifani, his sort of spiritual father, Patriarch Filaret, who died a week ago, he was very critical about the Greek Catholics, and he was against letting Greek Catholics enter St. Sophia, this old spiritual center in Kiev. He was against let them establish their centers in Kiev, and so on and so forth. So it's a sort of kind of very complex dynamics. With respect to religious freedom, well, I'll probably address why it's different in American mainstream media or expert discussion. I think, from my experience, what I know, first of all, experts, religious freedom actors, like people working for State Department or people working for U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, they probably are more critical, at least in informal communication. But the basic position is the same as with sanctions against Patriarch Kirill, because when the invasion started, there was a discussion, in particular in the State Department, are we going to impose some sanctions on Patriarch Kirill, at least symbolical, right? And there were concerns, first of all, there were religious freedom concerns because it's a religious figure and so on and so forth. And the second was a sort of practical, the second counter-argument was practical. Who cares what it will change, right? There are much more important issues. We have to prioritize them. It's not the biggest problem for Ukraine, and that's why we will stay away. And this is, by the way, the position of the European Union as well, European officials as well. So more or less, the answer to the question is that they really think that Ukraine has significantly bigger problems, and that's why we sort of, it's not our matter of priority. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is that, again, it's also, they also don't want to side with the Russian propaganda. Because this narrative that Ukraine has been, what J.D. Vance once said, that Ukraine persecutes Christians, it's a sort of a pattern of Russian propaganda, and they don't want, to side with that propaganda and to share the same messages with them. So,
please join me in thanking Dr. Vovk.